Hey, well, today I'm angry because we have lost our minds. And what I'm talking about is our sense of perspective, specifically deaths, specifically COVID 19 deaths and other deaths. Let's start by looking at exactly where we stand. This is August the 19th of 2020. And here's how we stand: COVID deaths in the US and worldwide. 176,000 deaths in the US to date. 790,000 deaths worldwide. That sounds like an enormous number. Is it? How many people normally die in the US every year? Here's the data, and this comes from the National Vital Statistics Report from 2017. How many people died in the US in 2017? 2.8 million people. And it breaks it down by age. So let's just look at one small subset. Keep these numbers in mind. 2,800,000 people died in the US in 2017. It is higher this year and would be higher anyway because the population is higher. But take a look at the number of people aged 75 or older who died in 2017. Now, I'll point out that this was not due to COVID-19. This was due to, I guess, mainly old age. But you're looking at 1.5 million people out of the 2.8 who died who were over 75 years old. And I will point out that this is by far the group most affected by COVID-19. What are the actual causes of death by cause? Is it all medical related? You know, it's not. Look at these startling figures. Accidents, 170,000 deaths. Almost the same as the number of deaths from COVID-19 so far. I mean, you've got suicide deaths, 47,000, accidental poisoning, 65,000, and take a look at this summary. Drug-induced deaths, 74,000, alcohol, 35,000, firearm injury, almost 40,000, assault by discharge of firearms, only 14,000 people. Now, granted, it is a tragedy for those 14,000 people, but those deaths are insignificant out of the number of deaths caused by all the other accidents. And yet, how much time do we spend focused on these deaths by firearm? It's the same as we focus on the deaths by COVID-19. This is all we talk about. Our entire economy has been turned completely upside down because of these deaths, half of which are among the very old among us who would be dying of other causes at a high rate anyway. I don't mean to be insensitive, but the extent of our reaction to deaths totaling 176,000 compared to the number of people who die from all these other accidents. I mean, how much attention do we spend on assault, firearm deaths? It's only 15,000 deaths. That's way too high and certainly dwarfs the rest of the world. But, I mean, compared to drug-induced deaths, 74,000, more than 4 times as much, 5 times as much, in fact. 5 times as many drug-induced deaths as deaths by firearms. And all we talk about is death by firearm. Just like we're distracted by this COVID-19 epidemic. Let's contrast 2 approaches to COVID-19, the US and Sweden. Here are USA daily new cases. And you can see that there was an initial swell in March and April and another one in June and July. But that is what flattening the curve means. It means that the curve is extended at an elevated level for a long period of time. Here are USA deaths. That's certainly an example of flattening the curve. It looks like it's going to be between 1,000 and 2,000 new deaths per day indefinitely. How does that compare to other countries like, for example, Sweden, which famously did not do a lockdown? Well, here are Sweden's daily new deaths. Virtually 0. They didn't flatten the curve. They had their spike and people died. And you can see that they're still having new cases at a significantly reduced rate. But they didn't flatten the curve. We all bought into flatten the curve. Flatten the curve became 2 weeks of lockdown, which is now 5 months of lockdown, which is now indefinite lockdown. And look at the effect. Look at Sweden. This is Sweden's GDP. In the first half of the year, their GDP fell by less than 10%. And they argue that it could have been substantially better than that if their neighbors had not locked down and their exports hadn't been crushed. How does that compare to where we are in the US? What do you think GDP is down? I mean, businesses have closed and will not reopen. Now, 176,000 deaths to date is nothing to laugh at. But compared to 2.8 million, I mean, what do you think suicide deaths have been over the last 6 months in the US? Our response to this pandemic has been entirely disproportionate. It's crazy. And we're setting the stage for the next one. Viruses come along all the time. New viruses come along all the time. It's a perpetual battle in the biological realm between us and microscopic invaders and opportunistic parasites. We're never going to be rid of them. We need to have a life with them. Our response has been crazy. There's been 170,000 deaths so far. I ask you, if our normal death rate is 2.8 million, of which 1.5 million are those over 75, wouldn't you think that the number of deaths would need to be dramatically higher to justify the actions that we've taken? You could argue that if there were young people, if kids were being affected dramatically, then yes, these emergency measures would be justified. But it's been known for months that only the elderly and those who are already sickly are being affected. Our response has been crazy. This is ridiculous. It's time to wake up.